Jo, who has never played the piano, finds her fingers instinctively dancing on the keys when she sees the sheet music. Upon safely returning from outer space, Jo discovers that the familiar world has become strange. Loved ones, colleagues, even the color of the car at home, all seem to have some discrepancies from her memory. Magnus and Alice are preparing to throw her a belated birthday party, and when they start playing a questioning game, the atmosphere freezes as Jo speaks her name in Dutch, something Magnus and Alice have never heard her say before. Yet Jo vividly remembers saying it more than once, with Alice even speaking some Dutch herself. Magnus is filled with suspicion. Confronting Jo about her seeming transformation since returning from space, their relationship had been strained before, and he was even contemplating divorce. Jo is shocked, exclaiming it's impossible, as she had longed to be back with Magnus every moment on the space station. Magnus remains unconvinced, prompting Jo to wonder if her memories are in disarray. She reevaluates every detail of her home and notices a piano in the living room, yet in her memory, no one in the household knows how to play. She wants to face it, and she was prepared to have a serious talk with Magnus. But Magnus immediately began to complain about various past grievances. In his mind, Jo had long lost her affection for the family. Even if she hadn't gone to the space station, every weekend was spent with Magnus alone, taking Alice to the cabin in the woods. Rumors among their friends had already spread about Jo having an affair with a colleague, and Magnus was fed up. He hoped Jo would openly admit it. Jo could hardly believe her ears after hearing this. She had never been involved with any colleague romantically. Her heart was only for Magnus and Alice. But how could Magnus easily believe otherwise? He promptly turned and left. Jo understood the seriousness of the situation, so she immediately sought out a psychologist. The change in Magnus and Alice's attitude, along with the distortion in her memory, brought significant distress to her life. The psychologist firmly diagnosed this as post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from Jo's life-threatening experience in space. Many high-risk professions, including soldiers, have experienced this illness, which, if severe, can lead to emotional volatility and loss of control. The psychologist prescribed a box of antidepressants to Jo, claiming it could effectively alleviate her stress responses. Jo reluctantly accepted the medication, but deep down, she resisted it. These types of psychotropic drugs could dull one's reactions, potentially preventing her from even being an astronaut anymore. Later, Jo put on her uniform and returned to the command center, where her colleagues welcomed the brave astronaut. However, Henry watched everything with a cold demeanor. He recalled a deadly incident at the space station decades ago, as if harboring a great secret. At that moment, Henry received some bad news. Due to the lack of progress in his experiment, the command center decided to suspend the project. Henry fell silent, lost in thought. Not long after, Henry approached Jo, inviting her to the laboratory under the pretext of an imminent breakthrough in the experiment. He casually asked Jo if she had encountered anything unexpected in space. Seeing her deep in thought, Henry mentioned a strange incident from many years ago. A colleague's son had died, and during his spaceflight, he encountered an accident. At a critical moment, he heard a boy's voice, which saved him from disaster. The colleague confirmed that the voice indeed belonged to his son. Henry had heard of similar occurrences before and encouraged Jo to recall carefully. At that moment, the experimental data seemed to fluctuate. Curiously, Jo approached to check, and her mind quickly flashed scenes from the space station. After leaving the command center, she prepared to pick up Alice from school. The teacher informed her that Alice had been behaving very withdrawn, possibly due to family circumstances. Jo noticed the teacher exchanging meaningful glances with Magnus from time to time. Upon returning home, she couldn't help but question Magnus about his relationship with the teacher. Magnus vehemently denied it, accusing Jo of being overly sensitive. Soon after, Jo discovered that Alice was missing. While searching, she unexpectedly found Alice hiding in the closet with her familiar bracelet necklace. When asked, Alice revealed that she often liked to hide in the closet for no reason. Jo felt a mixture of concern and bewilderment. Her impression of Alice was of an extremely outgoing child. When had she become so withdrawn? After Alice fell asleep, Jo approached the unfamiliar piano again. As her hands instinctively touched the keys, a clear melody began to play. Jo's expression turned to one of horror as she realized she had skillfully played the entire piece relying solely on muscle memory. It dawned on Jo that she was truly ill. She prepared to take the tranquilizers, but the pills seemed oddly familiar. During her rehabilitation training at the command center, the nutritionist had repeatedly emphasized the importance of taking vitamins. There happened to be a bottle at home that she hadn't finished. Jo took it out and carefully compared it with the tranquilizers. To her shock, she found that the vitamins provided by the base were identical to the tranquilizers. She hurried back to the command center to confirm whether these two were indeed the same medication. Ingredient identification revealed that the so-called vitamins from the base were actually tranquilizers that could induce dementia. Jo was incredulous. She couldn't fathom why the command center would do such a thing, so she rushed to the medical office to access the database. Medical records showed that several astronauts had been prescribed this medication, all sharing the common experience of seeing things they shouldn't have after returning from space. Suddenly, the room's lights came on, and two staff members entered to deliver documents. However, they seemed to completely ignore her presence. Jo shouted out in alarm, but when the room plunged back into darkness, the two employees had vanished without a trace. Jo felt a rising panic and had no desire to stay any longer. As she passed through the hallway, she spotted Henry still in his office. He was speaking to another version of himself on the screen. Suddenly, he turned and warned Jo, "Curiosity killed the cat." The next day, Jo was lost in thought when the colleague she was rumored to be involved with walked in, saying they needed to have a serious talk. He mentioned their agreement to leave together so they could be together forever. Jo's expression turned vacant, now she couldn't discern which memories were real anymore. In the afternoon, Jo was invited to give a speech at Alice's school. She witnessed Magnus and the teacher's flirtatious behavior once again and couldn't hold back her outburst, which resulted in laughter from the children, furthering Alice's sense of inferiority. On the way back, despite Jo's objections, Alice played music on her phone. This triggered something in Jo, causing her to once again see scenes from the space station, almost causing them to have a car accident. Upon returning home, the colleague unexpectedly dropped by uninvited. He came to confront Magnus, openly declaring his intention to run away with Jo. Jo was stunned speechless, she couldn't remember having any involvement with him. Magnus felt betrayed and demanded Jo to confess. The colleague insinuated that Jo might be suffering from some mental issues, and as he left, he warned Magnus to call him immediately if Jo exhibited any extreme behavior. Furious, Magnus stormed upstairs, leaving Jo feeling like her life was falling apart. She accidentally noticed a package on the table containing 2 cassette tapes. One was recordings of Jo's voice from her time at the space station. Curiously, she played it and heard a hoarse male voice before her own. The other cassette was a recording from a female astronaut who died in 1967. It also started with a hoarse male voice. Just then, Alice was awakened by the noise and came downstairs to find the living room hosting Jo's memorial service. Another version of Alice suddenly turned to look at her, but all these visions disappeared in an instant. Seeing Alice frightened, Magnus instinctively put her back into the closet. Jo felt this was inappropriate, but Magnus thought her reaction was excessive. Wasn't this what they always did? He believed Jo really needed to take the medication, but Jo saw it as a conspiracy. They wanted to trick her into taking tranquilizers to cover up what she saw in space. Magnus picked up the phone to call her colleague, further enraging Jo. She forcefully pushed Magnus to the ground, and he fell silent.